welcome to Barely Filtered, hosted by your friend Aurora. And man, I'm feeling different today. I have a little pep in my step, and it's because I took psychedelic drugs. Now, before you shut off this podcast, I am going to preface it by saying this was a medically induced, professionally assisted ketamine experience, and it was profound. You guys have heard me talk about how I have just been trying to figure out what's going on with the moods. Is it the hormones? Should I not drink alcohol anymore? And actually one of the guys that I dated was telling me that he had recently done ketamine, and he suggested that I try it. And I did. I found this doctor called Dr. Dow, and he's actually coming in today to talk about the experience. And I'm recording this intro after we just had our talk together, and it was probably, well, my producer just said it was her favorite talk ever that we've had on my show. So that's huge. It's so funny because he assisted my ketamine treatments, which were 2-hour treatments, in which he was kind of guiding me through this process of talking about childhood trauma and trauma that I had through my pregnancies. A lot of you might know the story of my second birth story, which was this wild experience of like waking up in the middle of the night, driving myself to the hospital, and then the doctor telling me that my baby was totally wrapped in her cord and being like, what got you here? And I was like, I don't know. It was just like I woke up and it was like I sleptwalk here. And there was a lot of trauma around that birth process because I think I felt guilty that I had done that to her, because during that pregnancy I was on an SSRI because I was having perinatal depression, which was left over from my depression, postpartum depression that I had from Remy. All of this to say, like, throughout my life has been this kind of like cha-cha of anxiety, depression, ADHD, and it looking pretty okay from the outside world, and I'm able to cope with it in different ways, sometimes from a medication, sometimes from a glass of wine, which has been probably the least productive habit of mine. And sometimes just by like being miserable in putting one foot in front of the other. And so I was really interested in ketamine because I have been reading up on psychedelic treatments for stubborn depression. And there's so much out there now. Actually, I mean, these studies have been going on since really the 40s. And there's a documentary I talk about later called How to Change Your Mind. And it's a book also written by Dr. Michael Pollan. And it talks a lot about how man-made psychedelics like LSD and ketamine, actually they don't talk about ketamine in this documentary, but they talk about psilocybin and LSD, and I think the other one is like MDMA, and how really beneficial these have been for many people who suffer from specifically like PTSD, anxiety, and stubborn depression. And for me, the experience that I've had with both of these, when I say trip, I feel like a druggie, but it's like it's just what I'm gonna call it. The experience that I had with my first trip was that it was a 2-hour session. They put it in my arm, and we did like talk therapy the whole time. For me, it felt like 10 minutes. For Dr. Dow, it was 2 hours. So it was funny during our conversation because he really feels like he knows me, and I kind of feel like I don't know who he is, because his voice the whole time was this very benevolent, godlike voice. And he's such a nice person, but I felt like I was with him for 10 minutes. Meanwhile, he knows like all of my trauma and all of my history and all the things that I've been like grappling with, and we get more into that in our conversation. But afterwards, I just felt this deep peace and like lift and return to hopefulness and awe and wonder that you experience as a child before life beats you down and makes you feel like everything's dumb and boring. So that's how I can describe it to you guys. It's been really kind of obviously mind altering, but life-changing. And obviously it's only been a week, so I'll keep checking in with you guys and letting you know if I still feel the same way. I have one more session, so I'm doing 3, and then there's like a maintenance protocol where you can do it a few times a year. He said like 3 or 4 times a year. So, but as of today, and I've done 2 sessions, I feel I'm not really sure what we fixed. Because that's the thing. I'm never really sure what's wrong. And the traumas don't need to be big. Like, it doesn't need to be like, oh, you were sexually abused your entire childhood. I mean, that's real for people, and that is huge trauma. It can be a culmination of small t traumas. And just life, like motherhood and birth and divorce. And even if you feel like you have nothing to complain about because you had great parents and you don't remember any trauma in your life, but you just feel like dead inside for some reason, the world will do that to you. And I don't think there needs to necessarily be a reason why we don't feel good. And I think a lot of times that puts guilt on us when we think about people who do have a reason to feel bad. And we don't have a reason to feel bad, and that makes us feel even worse, because why do we feel bad when we have no right to feel bad? And for me, ketamine has been a great solution to that, because it's lifted the small t's, the small traumas from my brain in their grasp on how I perceive the world. I feel like it's given me kind of like a zoomed out lens, which for somebody who is pretty like OCD can really ruminate on things and get stuck in my same way of thinking. Ketamine has been a great way to kind of set the reset button on those neural pathways. And Dr. Dow is here to talk about how that happened for me, how he's seen it happen for other people, and just his overall work with ketamine therapy. So buckle up. We're going for a trip. And now I am going to introduce Dr. Dow, a new friend of mine. This man has only seen me in my pajamas at my house with no makeup on, like crying. And this man, oh my gosh, it's so funny because your voice too. I did 2 ketamine sessions with Dr. Dow, and now I feel like your voice will always be associated with some kind of godly, like, I don't know, like benevolent force of, I don't know, just healing. Like, you really do have a gift for this. And I don't think, I can't imagine everybody does. It's really special. Like, tell me about, where did you get to a place of basically administering people drugs that a lot of people think are not good for you?
It's a remarkable journey, right? Ketamine itself has a remarkable journey, which of course I've talked about in my book on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. But I really want to talk about you and, this process. And, when I get to work with somebody like you, I've seen you in person. This will be the, third time in person? Yeah. I feel like I know you so well. Like I feel like I know you better than I know acquaintances that I've had for years, because I feel like I got to know the essence of who you are.
Yeah.
I got to know your soul. I got to know where all of your deep-rooted beliefs come from. And for me, that's so rewarding. As I was walking in here with your amazing producer, I said, oftentimes I tear up because she was, telling me, oh, thank you. We were just talking about the work you did with Olivia. And I said, I'm the one who's always so in awe of the work that you do, because this work, it's not like taking a medication. It's not even like standard talk therapy where you're going to sort of every week dig a little bit deeper. It requires you, because now it requires you to go so deep and consider the essence of who you are. And what you said to me just 2 minutes ago, it's like a return, right?
Yeah.
It's like a return.
Yeah, I think, so I'm skeptical, and I think I have a lot of confusion around where some of my pain has always come from. That's part of this podcast of like, why do I have ADHD symptoms? Why do I have anxiety and depression? Why do I sometimes abuse drugs and alcohol? It's like, come on this journey with me and let's try to fucking figure it out, because like, I'm not going to try to hide it. And I know that I'm not the only one feeling this way, because I think I just read that 1 in 4 women between the ages of like 40 and 55 are on some kind of antidepressant.
Yep. Correct.
And as somebody who's gone through, just the process of birthing 2 humans and then the divorce and everything. And like, when I hear about ketamine, I've heard about it as kind of for people who were in Iraq, who with like major PTSD, treatment-resistant depression. And for me, whenever I did go on an SSRI, it was quite helpful for me. So I was like, maybe ketamine's not for me. But something in me wanted to try it because I felt like it was this bridge between the spiritual and the science of depression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Would you say that, well, first of all, since you've had 2 sessions and the last one was just, 48 hours ago?
Yeah. I'm still high. No, I'm just kidding. It's quick.
Did you experience any sort of lift? What's the mood improvement now that it's had a couple of days to sort of settle and integrate?
Yeah, I definitely feel a lift. Right after the treatment, I would say I felt a little confused still, like just in a fog, really trying to pay attention to how I was interacting with my kids because I didn't really have the luxury of being able to process everything and go journal and sit in nature. Like I had my kids come back and be like, I want macaroni and cheese. Throwing, Yeah. So at first I felt really good and I could see myself kind of doing things in a meditative way and with a little bit more thoughtfulness to the way I would cook and the way I would even choose to cook rather than ordering DoorDash like I have been doing for too many months in a row to count. Like I'm getting back to cooking just in the last 2 weeks, I guess 1 week that we've been doing the ketamine. So like little things like that and just kind of a brighter outlook. And I remember one of the things that happened during my trip, if you want to, for lack of a better word, was I remembered like the little girl me. You asked me, how does she feel? And I was like, she has a lot of hope. Like she feels like at her essence, there's a lot of hope for the future. And I think that's one of the things as we get older, even if we don't have a lot of trauma, but this kind of like so much life happens to us and we almost become deadened to the excitement for life and the hope for our future.
That's right.
And that's what I felt like in the last couple days. Like I just felt like I'm just a little bit more, it's a return to that essence. So it's rather than like an SSRI that's adding something and kind of deadening and numbing, which
some people need at some times, but this work is so different, right? And you said it so beautifully. It's a return to.
Right.
We do not come into this world with an ego. We develop the ego, and we got to meet the inner child, that little girl, and you remembered that the essence of who you are, she is so hopeful. She is so curious. She loves life. There are things that bring her joy. Those yoga poses that, the day after our first session, you said you were in tears. And that was sort of like it's something that hadn't happened a while. Or the organic will to go to the grocery store and cook this delicious meal mindfully for you and your kids. It is a return to that former state. So it works in a very, very different way than SSRIs. And I think what most people would be most surprised, and maybe I'm going to ask you, were you surprised to learn we did a full 50-minute preparation therapy session before the 2-hour ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session. And in that first session, we were talking the entire time. So most people think, I'm just going to, quote, take this medicine and let the medicine do the work. Oh, no. You did a lot of work. You did a lot of deep work that probably would have taken us 6 months, 2 years in standard talk therapy to actually get to. And it goes right to the heart of it. Did you feel that? Did that surprise you?
I mean, it's surprising to hear you say that because to me, each ketamine session that we did felt like 15 minutes. So it's not that I don't remember.
The perception of time goes away too.
Totally. Yeah. It's not that I don't remember us talking, but I do remember feeling... Yeah, I do feel like we processed a lot and almost to the point where it's like all of the stages of grief just like consolidate and you kind of come out from this for like being forgiving.
Right. Towards yourself.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned when I first used the word, we were doing a lot of this deep parts work, right, with the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And there's that part of our ego that we call the firefighter that douses the flames of pain when we're in pain. And I think before I met you, you had that, as you said a few minutes ago, you had this judgment towards that firefighter. Like, why am I the kind of person who wants to always seek more, right? Why would I sometimes seek a glass of wine to make me feel better? And I think the shift is having compassion that there's a part of your ego that is doing that because you're still in pain. So the first time I said that word firefighter to you, Aurora, it was so interesting because you had that shift. The first thing you said to me is, oh my God, that's such a good word for it, right? And I think the shift is there is a part of Aurora that is doing something that's trying to take away pain. And we need to gently ask her, what does she need to see from you, your life, the core wounds that you had, including a very traumatic birth experience that I believe was one of the very core wounds, in addition to some of your childhood experiences, that led to and created that anxiety or sometimes inattention. And if we can have compassion for those parts while also going to the root, it's just a different paradigm, right?
Yeah.
We're not pathologizing. We're not saying, in a very typical way, anxiety disorders, okay, we want to take your anxiety from a 9 to a 0 with, for example, a benzodiazepine. We're not trying to medicate it and just bring it down. Rather, what I saw in you is a shift where you could actually understand where they're all coming from. And through that, the different parts of Aurora were actually able to say, oh, I understand what the work is. Like, I understand who I am, and I'm not going to judge myself for that. And maybe I'm going to do things differently.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, now that you say that, because since our last session was 2 days ago, right? And since then, I feel like I've been more emotional, but in a good way. Like, normal. I feel like I can hyper feel things. And like, I saw something sad today on actually Dr. Ali Abadi's page. It was about a mother with ovarian cancer, and like, I was just crying, but in a way that felt very it didn't feel sad. It just felt like I have so much compassion, and there's a difference there. Like, I remember after I had my son, and I feel like a lot of the trauma that I was able to get over from this ketamine treatment was from my postpartum experiences with both my children, that I didn't really realize. You kind of think, like, once you get past postpartum, like my kids are 4 and 6 now, that you're healed just by time, but not really. And what I realize is, like, when I think back to those times, especially during postpartum, I would hear stories, horrible things, and it would debilitate me to the point where, like, I couldn't really breathe. And that was like a lack of oxygen that kind of just was my life for a long time, just kind of trying not to look too deeply at things because life was like just too painful. And now I feel like the ketamine allows me to look at things in a way that I have like my perspective is bigger, where I'm able to see that, yes, sad things happen and bad things do happen, but ultimately, like, there's this little girl hope and belief that everything ultimately is good and for the good of everything.
And now you shifted in that belief that the universe is conspiring in your favor, that there's something, this law of evolution and forward motion, it's all for the greater good of all of us. And if we can lean into that, yes, there are dark things. Yes, there are parts of our shadow that we don't want to own. And yes, there is evil and there's sadness and all of those things. But if we have that belief that you leaned into, you said something very similar, right? It's like, the universe is conspiring in my favor. And at certain times in your life, you forgot that. And I saw that shift where you return to that. And if that is your innate, organic, authentic self, and if everything you do can come from that place, even if you notice a firefighter coming in that wants to self-medicate because you're in pain or you're anxious, or the anxious voice that has this deep-rooted belief of what awful thing could happen because that thing happened, right? Because I think your birth trauma, it was really rooted in such a deep, scary place. But, I got chills and, oh man, when you were talking about that and you said that your intuition, which is your higher self, there was something in you that told you, I've got to go to the hospital right now. I'm going to do it in a calm way. I'm going to lean over. I'm going to tell my husband, you stay here with our other kid. I'm going. You didn't panic. And you remember that there's a part of you that is always operating, and she is greater. That's Aurora's higher self.
Right.
And she's the one in charge, not the anxious voice inside your head.
Right. And I loved what Dr. Yu, what she said, which is, so during my treatment, there's Dr. Dow, who's there to help me process the psychology of all of it. And then there's Dr. Yu, who's the actual, she's an actual medical doctor. And she administers the medicine, which is a shot that goes into my muscle. And one of the things that she said, and she holds such great space too.
She?
Like, I could hear her in the background just being like, yeah. Like, she's kind of just like the choir woman who's like, amen.
Yeah.
But she said, Aurora, do you notice that there's a difference between the intuition voice and the anxious firefighter voice who's trying to be hypervigilant and put out all of the bad emotions that come up all the time and thinks that she has to have eyes on everything. It's that the voice of intuition is always calm.
Yeah.
And that was so profound to me because I really never thought about it that way. I think we all think, well, those of us who suffer from anxiety, a lot of us feel that we need to that part of us that's anxious has helped us in life because it's helped us avoid, certain situations. And we have real proof of this. But when you think about the times when you've really been able to harness the vigilance, it's a calm intuition.
It really is. And it's a shift, and you can be discerning, right? So that part of you that's saying, but look at all the things I did for Aurora. Look at how I helped her to be successful, to raise her kids as a single mom after the divorce. Yes, those things are true. And there are times when different archetypes within us, different parts of our personality, different parts of our ego, they come forward, and sometimes they think that they are us. They think that I'm the higher self, I'm the CEO of who Aurora is, and I'm the one leading the charge. And then you think, wow, why am I so XYZ? Why am I so anxious? Why am I so scattered? You have that, what you described as your cha-cha-cha voice, where it's like there are so many voices inside your head sometimes when you're trying to make a decision, and it just feels so fast. And it's almost like the first time I met you, and I think that first ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session, it was really understanding that those were the different parts of your ego trying to sort of negotiate in a really hard way, where it's almost like one is going to come in really strong. And if we're looking at the anxious voice and the firefighter, it's like there is some part of you that is going to come in so strong and make you so anxious because she's type A and she wants to do all the things. And then she comes in there guns a-blazing, and then some other part of you has to compensate for her, right?
Right.
So it's sort of this rubber fence. When one part of your ego goes to one extreme, you're going to have an equal and opposite reaction according to the laws of physics.
Right.
And what I saw soften was a shift in you where you were actually understanding that maybe the parts of you could actually get along, and maybe no one part is actually the CEO of the fullness of who Aurora actually is. Right. So it's so spiritual. Wouldn't you say it was a profound spiritual experience?
It was definitely profound. And I love the way that you kind of talk about us in a very schizophrenic way, where we have multiple personalities, because it's true. And any of us who have ever seen the movies Inside Out, this internal
metaphor.
family system. And we were talking about Gabby Bernstein the other day too. We do have these different parts of us. And I think that is what the exhaustion comes from, that then leads to depression, of trying to fight the different parts of us or rationalize them, and then you get so tired that you just want to numb them. And it's this cycle that I think a lot of us live in. I don't know. I mean, that's the whole vibe of this podcast. I'm hoping somebody else out there feels that way. Otherwise, this is just the me show.
I'm sure.
But yeah, I do feel like maybe that's what it is. Maybe I'm more calm, and that's why I feel more hopeful and bright, because the different parts in my head are working together.
Yeah. And it's so nice that some of those things just bubbled up. I didn't tell you to go to the grocery store and cook a meal. Yeah. That organically just sort of surfaced, and it's that shift from being a human being to a human doing. So yes, there is this archetype, there's this part of you that I can see right now, and I'm thinking, wow, she is such a good podcast host. She is so engaging. And it was a very different part of you. Well, I saw that part, but she was only a part of you. And I can see that part of you is leading this charge, and she's so good at it.
Thanks.
And I can also see that if this productive, charismatic, always caring about other people and doing so many things and driving conversations forward, whether it's your kids' teachers or me or these guests, she can get exhausted. And also it's a real masculine part that I've had to live in since my divorce, of like, I'm the sole breadwinner, and I'm also have my career, and I'm single, and I don't have that masculine like person to lean on in my life, really. I don't even really have like, I need to start calling my dad more, but I realized the other day, like, I think as we get older too, like, we don't talk to our parents as much. My parents live on the other side of the country, and I think also just trying to figure out some of this headspace that I've been in. It's like, is it my parents? Maybe sometimes you have conversations with your parents and you wish you didn't, And so I think I've been a little scared to have conversations with my parents. So the dad role model has been kind of out.
And when I say scared to have conversations with my parents, it's because I've been feeling in a vulnerable place. And you know that those two people have more capacity than anybody else to hurt you. At least that's my experience.
To hurt and to heal us.
And to heal.
And, it's really nice, and it's not black or white. I think some people who lean on the past as the sole defining feature of our pathology or what we need now or what we're struggling with. Yes, there are wonderful things that all of our parents did. And there are some things based on who we are and the goodness of fit of us versus our caretakers. There are a lot of things that you didn't get that I think Aurora did need.
Right.
Now, yes, you can have conversations, and there are some of those pieces that maybe you can begin to get from them. And anything that's missing, this is the beautiful part of attachment and what I consider the new attachment theory, right? So a lot of people know what attachment is, and am I dating a guy who's avoidantly attached, and am I anxiously attached? But we also have that within ourselves. So we can be the anchor, that primary attachment figure within ourselves. So, I think many times I asked you about your inner mother. What would your own inner mother do for your own inner child? So now you have a parent-child relationship within yourself. And what's beautiful is I believe it's your inner mother and the feminine within you, that yin energy that said, I mindfully love to cook. I want to go to yoga. There was a release that I had in that camel pose that brought me to tears. And it was that feminine energy and allowing yourself to be in that feminine energy that was so beautiful. And, I'm also, when you're talking about these two doctors, what's so beautiful, just in case people don't know, there's such a difference between ketamine IV clinics, which are the most popular just in terms of prevalence. Because
is that like Field Trip? Is that
no, Field Trip was also ketamine assisted psychotherapy, but there are a lot of IV ketamine clinics where it's an IV of ketamine. You're in a room, a nurse or nurse practitioner hooks you up with an IV, and you're sort of in a room by yourself listening to music. What we do is very, very different. You are doing work. It is primarily psychotherapy that the medicine aids in, right? And you have an MD, Dr. Felicia Yu, who is just incredibly brilliant.
She really is.
She's an internal medicine physician. She's also trained in Chinese medicine, so she understands some of those energetic balances of the yin and the yang, the feminine and the masculine. And then you have me, a PhD, so we work as this dyad, and you are so safe medically, which allows you to psychologically and spiritually access the parts of you that you need to transform. It's literally like an alchemy. You're transforming in this really powerful, deep way.
I also love, I'm not going to lie. So the way that I found Dr. Yu was, many of you have heard about the guy that I was kind of dating for like 4 dates who lost his wife to breast cancer, and he had done ketamine therapy, and he recommended Dr. Dow for me, probably because he was like, you fucked up, you're gonna need some help. And I was like, thank you, we're not gonna work out, but honestly, what amazing came from that, right? What amazing things have come from that. But when I heard that you were a man, obviously I was like, no, I'm not going under drugs like in the company of a man. I think a lot of women are hesitant to that. And then I heard that Dr. Yu would be there too, who's a woman. I felt a little better about it. But then also just getting to talk to you, I was like, okay, this is a different kind of a man. This is a man who I don't feel... energetically, I don't feel afraid of. And I feel like that... I feel like men and women can be comfortable in your care, which is so amazing.
I've heard that a lot, and I really believe that for you, it's a small corrective emotional experience to have a man who is there in a different way.
Yeah.
And maybe that's actually, even though a
healing
part of
in
you,
itself.
Right.
Totally.
Even though you wanted to avoid it, it's maybe what you needed the most.
Yeah.
And isn't that so true for all of us?
I know. It's crazy. Yeah. That alone, I think, was super healing. I do want to, because even for myself, I'm not sure I really understand it. Like, what is ketamine doing to my brain? Oh,
such a good question. Okay, now that nerd in me gets to come out. So it is doing so many things at one time. And what's really incredible is, if SSRIs like Lexapro or benzodiazepines like Xanax are sort of like a lever, right? And it's almost like this old theory of all mental illness is just that you have an imbalance of one neurotransmitter, and we can figure out what that neurotransmitter is. And if you have anxiety, you have not enough GABA, so use a benzo, turn up the GABA. If you have depression or sometimes anxiety, it's not enough serotonin, so an SSRI is going to sort of turn up the serotonin. A very simplistic view.
Right.
Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is so different. So yes, it does via this excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate, which is this excitatory and abundant neurotransmitter. That pathway is very different than the serotonin receptors that Lexapro work on. So it's almost like this master switch, and it's allowing all of those, not just glutamate, which is one neurotransmitter, but all of those different pathways. So it's actually increasing levels of many neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin. But then this is the exciting part, because this is what other medications and treatment protocols don't do. It creates a window of neuroplasticity. So it really allows some of the things, and you and I talked about this with Dr. Yu, the things that you do in that window following these treatments, your brain is more pliable. So you can create new neural pathways. How common is it that through our life, because we're all like Pavlovian dogs, we associate this emotion with this response. And the more we do that, the more cemented that is in the brain, and the more easily we can access that pathway. Ketamine sort of, it's sort of like an Etch-a-Sketch where there's like a drawing. Ketamine is sort of like shaking that Etch-a-Sketch, and now it's blank. Now it's like, well, what do I want to do? What is my higher self? How do I want to hold that anxiety, and how do I want to choose a different behavior so I can begin to link a different emotion or thought with a different behavior.
Right.
It is also, and this is really fascinating. So trauma doesn't just lead to emotional problems or symptoms. It actually damages the cells in your brain. It damages the neurons, right? So what we've seen in animal studies and brain imaging is that there are these parts of the neurons that after trauma, they get damaged and they're sort of flat.
Right.
After one dose of ketamine in the scans, the neurons in those animals, they're sort of like remodeled, and they're brought back to their original state.
What about like a concussion damage?
They're studying psychedelics for concussions. So, I think those protocols are going to come down the line, and there are some studies. And, the neuroplasticity, if there is damage to the brain, and a lot of times with concussion, we see a lot of depression, and ketamine is such a profound antidepressant that you can use it in those cases. Right. Even though it's not, I would argue that sometimes functionally things like hyperbaric oxygen are maybe going to the core of that particular scenario. But with trauma, because we all have these capital T big traumas and these small t little traumas, and they affect us. They affect our belief system of what we believe about ourselves and the world. And if they can damage the neurons, then maybe some of the things that we feel are because we actually need to sort of fix the neuron, right? We actually, so it's really interesting. And then it's also an anti-inflammatory for the brain. So a lot of times, in some of my other books that focus more on food and mental health and the relationship, if you eat a very pro-inflammatory diet, you are far more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And if you have inflammatory compounds in your body, those mental illnesses will get worse. Right. So ketamine also acts as an anti-inflammatory for the brain. So it's working on all of these different pathways at the same time. And that is what is remarkable, because it was originally, 60 to 70 years ago, designed as anesthesia to be used by anesthesiologists or ER doctors for something like, your kid has a broken arm. And this is still very true today. ER doctor gives your kid a little bit of ketamine. They can fix the arm, something very painful, in, out, doesn't really affect your respiratory system, super safe in the doses that we use, which of course everybody's talking about Matthew Perry. The doses that we use in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, nowhere near those doses.
Well, I also can't imagine you had giving me the dose that you did give me and then leaving me in a hot tub by myself.
Which we would never do.
Well, yeah.
And we're also monitoring. So, the
he
reason...
He died from drowning.
He died from drowning. He did not, the ketamine overdose. No, he was in an unconscious state near a body of water with levels of ketamine that no physician who should have been there with him at that time administering the medicine, which was also not true. That is why he died. But we're also monitoring your blood pressure before and after.
Right.
We saw how the ketamine affected your blood pressure, which for you really didn't. So we knew that we could go up, and we're sort of, we're keeping you very, very safe. Right.
Oh, I did feel totally safe. Although the first treatment, I was fighting it for sure. But I just want to go back to what you were saying about how it kind of presses the reset button on the brain. Because one thing that I've also noticed since we started the treatment is that for me, wine is really like something that I need at the end of the day, because I pair like being high stress with like a glass of wine. And I don't know if maybe because I feel less stressed or because the pairing is not there anymore, but I haven't even wanted wine.
Oh,
so I haven't
look
drank.
at that.
And
Look
like
at
if I
that.
don't drink, I would imagine that now, you know, the pairing won't be quite as strong. And now I'm almost like, I want to experiment, like go to a concert and not drink, and like go
Yes.
to like a party and not drink, because these associations are so strong.
That's right. And the ketamine allowed it to sort of, that etch-a-sketch metaphor, that your pairing is so much more effective, and it's so much faster with a little bit of ketamine on board, because you've opened the window of neuroplasticity. Your brain right now, as you and I are talking, is more plastic than it was a week ago before you started this
It
protocol.
makes me very scared though. I was telling Dr. Dow this after our first session, like I felt great and I didn't want anybody to mess that up for me, because I'm a little nervous that I don't want anybody to bother me, because I don't want it to be now ingrained in my brain. you know?
In an ideal setting, we would all go to Miraval or Canyon Ranch, and we'd all do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy sessions over the course of 2 weeks. But since that is not possible for most of us, that's a very common phenomenon where it's like you have this ethereal, spiritual, deep experience, and that fragility, or not that fragility, but that open-hearted state. Ketamine, like MDMA, is an empathogen. It opens your heart. So sometimes, unlike SSRIs, which tend to, one of the main side effects that people report that is, I think probably in my experience, the number one reason why people want to consider ketamine as a replacement for their SSRI is that emotional blunting, where it's like, it can help if you're just drowning in sorrow and you're having a really hard time in your life. There's a difference between the sort of blunting effect and ketamine. Ketamine does the opposite.
Right.
So sometimes I tell people it is normal for us to feel sometimes, as all of these states are sort of becoming your new normal and your heart is opening, you may start to wonder, is this making me worse or better? Because maybe you're going to cry more for the 3 days after a treatment. And it's usually what you needed to do.
I feel like my sleep has been a little different. Like I've definitely been having more vivid dreams. And the first time we did the session, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling a little anxious. But I read about something called emotional compression. Can you speak to that?
We all compress our emotions in different parts, especially our manager ego parts. They really don't want us to fully express the trauma, right? They have this belief or this fear that if Aurora actually talks about the depth of her darkest experiences and the scariest ones, that she's not going to be okay. So they just sort of keep a lid on some of those painful parts of who we are. And that emotional compression, a lot of times it leads to a lot of somatization. So a lot of times we put those emotions in the body and people will have more physical symptoms or experiences. I think for you, we identified it. We went right to your gut, right?
Yeah.
Like your gut is where you hold that tightness. And if you have this empathogen, ketamine, and you have this type of psychotherapy with it, it really is like letting all of the air out of the balloon that you've probably been carrying some of these pains and sorrows and anxieties for decades of your life. Some of them are from childhood. And, what was it like for you growing up? And, for everything that your parents and family gave you, and, being I know you have an older brother, but, you're the youngest, you're the oldest girl, what that means. And there was probably just a lot of that type A it's probably why you're here. It's probably why you're so successful. And there was a piece of it that probably also compressed your emotions in this protocol. Do you feel lighter? Does it feel like that air got taken out of the balloon so it wasn't so prone to pop, right?
Definitely. I can definitely speak to that. And part of me is like, I don't want to stop doing it. But then I know the like little addict part in my brain that's like, well, do I really want more? Is more always good? And in your book, you talk about how you did a session in Austin. And I remember hearing you say that the effects lasted for like 9 months. Was that just one session?
In my training in Austin, I had 2 sessions, a low dose and a high dose of ketamine.
Oh, so higher than my dose?
Higher than yours. So, let's talk about that, because the psychedelic experience, your first session, a lot of people, what I say, please don't, the IV ketamine model, especially for patients with trauma, for some people it's great. Lamar Odom, in a conversation I had with him, it was like he was in heaven and he did IV ketamine. And for some people that works. For other people, it will take you to hell. And if you have a lot of trauma and you go right for that deep ketamine experience without some of the processing that we did, it can really make people worse, not better. So it really is about the person. You want to get to know their history. And, your first session is what we call the psycholytic dose. So you are able to talk the whole time, even though with that second dose of medicine, what Dr. You and I typically do, especially for the first few sessions, always is we split the dose. So instead of you getting all of the medicine at one time, the two shots are spread out. So you sort of get this nice, gentle, you're in, then it starts to wear off. Then you go in and a little bit deeper.
Right.
And then in your second session, you were sort of on the cusp of that psychedelic dose.
Yeah.
And now, a lot of people ask, well, is ketamine like psilocybin or LSD? And while it's man-made, in the mid to high doses, it has those psychedelic qualities. So now you have the mystical qualities.
Right.
And, when you were sort of leaving your body, a lot of times it's almost like the astronaut who is looking at the Earth from the moon for the first time. And that's sort of like us looking at our ego in our life. And you sort of leave the body and you have this mystical experience where you feel at one with all living beings, or this sense that love is the ultimate reality. In my high-dose ketamine session during my training, it felt like I was in the reality of love, and I knew that love was all there is. And that sounds so weird to say, but that was, I don't even have words for it, but those are the closest words that I have to explain that experience.
Right.
And then you come back from that. So the biochemical effects, like if you were just comparing ketamine to an SSRI, looking at the biomechanics, the physiology, those don't last that long, right? And that's why in the protocol for example, severe treatment-resistant depression, we usually start with 6 sessions with ketamine within a 30-day period. And then we move people to what we call the maintenance or the booster doses. So then after the 6, which is, we go very, very deep, then you kind of have what I like to call your reminder dose. So typically, when combined with therapy, patients on average will just need 1 booster dose every 3 months. So yes, it's time consuming and expensive, and you've got to go really deep when you start. And then it's almost like a little, you move to the maintenance stage.
Right.
So the biochemical effects of ketamine as an antidepressant, they don't last all that long, up to 3 months after that stacking protocol. But the spiritual aha moments, I'm changed forever. Like the experience that I had in my high dose experience, I didn't know who my ego was. I was so outside of my ego. I had no idea where I was. I didn't know that I was in Austin. I was in that other realm.
And you really
fully.
remember that? You feel like it's been imprinted on you?
Deep in my soul, yeah.
But you say that the biochemical benefits don't last. So are these people, so then explain somebody who, was suicidal and now has never been suicidal again.
Well, what's interesting is that in studies with ketamine, the majority of patients with suicidal ideation, they will no longer be suicidal after their first dose, but it only lasts a day, which is why we have to stack. But if you have an existential crisis, right? If you don't know who you are and why you are and what is this life all about, those are things that SSRIs can't touch.
No.
No.
You
need a mystical experience. You need to figure out who you are.
Right.
And in psychedelic research, we use something called the Mystical Experiences Questionnaire, and it sort of measures all of the facets that are mystical in psychedelic experiences. And what we find is people who have, and this is typical with higher doses, sort of where we got to, I feel like you were in that, like a light psychedelic experience in that second session. The more mystical experiences you report on that questionnaire, typically the greater reduction in depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD. So there's a second way or a second pathway. There's the Western scientific way that ketamine is working, but there's a separate pathway where, because something called the default mode network in the brain, which is sort of the me network, it's where your ego lives, because ketamine and other psychedelics turn that part off or deactivate it, and you have no sense of Aurora in this room, and you sort of join consciousness in this way. I know you've practiced transcendental meditation, so you have that sense of oceanic consciousness, and you are that consciousness. So there is that second pathway where it's via the mystical experiences that actually changes your experience of the world, what your life is about, and then you have less depression because of that too.
And that is forever lasting.
Yeah.
That is, and I don't know if it was in your book or I think it was, but somebody was talking about how the opposite of depression is really like wonder and awe, which makes so much sense.
Awe and wonder are probably, when I am looking at facial expressions in deep ketamine states in my work, awe and wonder is what I see. Awe and wonder are emotions like inner child Aurora,
I
like
know.
that.
That is so childlike.
It is.
It's like when you feel like you know everything and you have all the answers. That's
it's mundane
the worst.
and depressing, right?
So
it's
depressing.
Like over and over. Get the kids up. Get the lunches ready. Go record the podcast. And it's like, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And for all of us, that can be depressing.
Yeah.
And when you step out of that with a sense of awe and wonder, that's when everything begins to shift.
Yeah, and I think that just me cooking dinner is kind of a little microcosm of that bigger phenomenon, because it's like, yeah, cooking dinner can be mundane and boring and a task that I have to do, or it could be something that is really inspiring and creative.
And spiritual for you, right? It's a reminder of that inner child who loves cooking and what it means and that connection. If you take a food and that tomato from Whole Foods and you cook it up and you realize how many people handled that, and you realize that nature, speaking of, sorry to get all metaphysical and spiritual about a tomato, but
I love it.
If the universe is conspiring in our favor and nature created these antioxidants and created, we have 5 different kinds of taste buds: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami. And isn't it so interesting that when you take the sweetness of a fruit or a vegetable, right, that nature has programmed us to, the sweeter the fruit, the more vitamin C is in it, for example, in fruits and vegetables with vitamin C. And if it's poisonous, it gets more bitter. And if it's not ripe enough, it's not poisonous, but it doesn't have enough vitamins or as many vitamins.
Yeah.
And our taste buds correlate with nature so that the foods that are going to nourish us are the ones that taste better to us. So isn't it even interesting that science is conspiring in our highest good? And maybe in my belief, I have a very, I would call a religious and also a very spiritual understanding of God. I would say I believe in God, and I understand all religious traditions, and I also combine that with a very metaphysical understanding of God. And I believe that God is nature and nature is God.
Yeah.
And when we look at the way evolution has protected us and everything is following this law of trying to better all of us, it's like, oh, even the tomato I'm cooking, that's for my highest good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like this totally different way to look at our lives.
Yeah. I think I was blown away by when I was breastfeeding and how the mother's breast milk actually will totally change its composition based on what the baby needs in each week of life. It's like, and then I'm like, oh, I can do all that without even trying? That's way more than I can do when I try.
Yeah. And if that's true, it's like, oh, there's this inner healing intelligence. There is this intuition. There's this higher self that I have that I don't have to do anything. Right? My body does that. Nature, God, spirit, whatever you want to call it, does that for me. And if that's true, I think the root of so much anxiety in this world is we overestimate how much power and control we have.
Right.
And the more that part of our ego tries to control more and gets so scared that it can't control everything, you can try to control more.
That has never worked for me.
Exactly. You do the opposite and you relinquish control and you realize that in most cases, we don't have control.
Right.
We have far less control than our ego wants us to think. And if we release into that, like the breast milk story for you, that is the ultimate contentment, peace, awe, wonder, which is a much stronger antidote to most forms of depression and anxiety.
Yeah, that's so powerful. That was my whole trip, really, at least with my second session, of realizing that if I fight it, it's worse. And if I turn away from the things that are scary, it gets scarier. But if you just walk through the door or you just lean into the things that feel a little uncomfortable and trust that you're taken care of, everything becomes brighter.
Isn't that wild? You know, one of the things we say to people as part of the quote flight instructions is if you see a door, open it. If you see something challenging or scary, walk towards it, not away from it. And the medicine tends to know exactly what you need. Mm-hmm. It activates the deepest parts of who you are. It taps into the collective unconscious, your own unconscious. And there is people who have this very rigid defense mechanism system where they're never allowed or will allow people to see the hurt or the insecurity within them. Man, first of all, those people really need to start. Yeah, because ketamine touches the defenses in ways that their ego can usually bob and weave around standard talk therapy and always come up with a reason why that part of them is, you know, they minimize, they rationalize, they're defensive, and you never get in. Well, the medicine can always get in.
It's always going to get in.
And for those people, the fear in them that they have to confront and in this psychedelic space is realizing how small they are.
I know.
And the parts of their ego realize, oh, I'm no match. And that's scary. But if they lean into that, through that process, sometimes the ego says, oh, maybe I don't have to work so hard.
Yeah, it's
maybe
the scariest thing, but it's actually also the best thing.
Exactly.
When you learn it.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, I am so small. I've been trying not to be small, but actually maybe being small is like where it's at. A couple like logistical questions that I know people are going to ask, because I'm not gonna lie, I didn't tell very many people that I did, that I was going to do ketamine. I definitely did not tell anybody in my family. I said it to my management, and one of my managers was like, oh, I don't know if I can get behind this one. Like somebody who I know is really struggling with an addiction to ketamine. So like, I just feel like this is not what I don't want to get behind this. And, you know, everybody's bringing up Matthew Perry and everything. Is there a really bad side effect that we should all be aware of?
The main side effect is nausea during the session. Okay. It can, for some people, you know, if you have uncontrolled hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which is why we check your blood pressure and doctor you if you have high blood pressure before a session. She will administer a medicine that will bring your blood pressure down before the ketamine. Mm-hmm. So you want to do it in a container that is very safe, because the set and setting, it really affects it. So is there an addictive potential for people who are taking ketamine by themselves every weekend for fun? Yes, there can be an addictive potential. Ketamine in and of itself is not highly addictive, right? So I don't like to classify medicines as addictive or not addictive. What I will say is that ketamine is more, you know, there are the uppers like cocaine, there are the downers like heroin, and then psychedelics are sort of like the all-arounders. They're not really uppers or downers. Right. They're something different entirely. Most people have far less problems with the quote all-arounders, like psychedelics, than they do with, you know, if you give somebody crystal meth every day, or you give somebody heroin every day, most people will develop an addiction.
Right.
So it's really about the set and setting. And if you use it in this way, where, you know, Doctor, you and I are coming to your house maybe a few more times, and you have that, or maybe it already happened, and your intuition says, I got what I needed. And then maybe if you need a reminder, you know, in a couple of months, or something happens in your life and you need to do 2 more sessions, you know, we don't really see a high risk of addiction. It's not, we're not saying it's not there for some people.
Right.
And if somebody came to us and said that, you know, I'm sober and my drug of abuse was ketamine, and I abused ketamine every day for 18 years, that's probably not a candidate.
Right.
For most people, you know, paradoxically, for people with alcohol addictions, most other drugs, ketamine actually has wonderful anti-addiction properties.
That's what I feel from it.
Right, exactly.
Because
right.
But I also know I'm the kind of quote unquote addict who is not like a physically dependent addict, where like they kind of would shut the door on me in AA, but because I don't have what they call it, the allergy of the brain. But I think for most of anybody who suffers from substance abuse, it's because they're using it to treat an underlying symptom, underlying depression.
A depression, you know, and that allergy and obsession that people have in as part of AA and what they sort of identify, even though you didn't identify with that, I think what you were seeking, there was a part of you that sought AA because you were looking for that spiritual program.
Which I love. I wish they would let me. Well, I still practice the 12 steps. I mean,
we all should in some way, right?
I love them.
And it's so interesting. A lot of people do, and some people don't know this, but, Bill W., the founder of AA,
oh my God, I love
had LSD-assisted psychotherapy sessions, and he wanted to bring LSD-assisted psychotherapy, so psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, into the program of AA.
I thought that was crazy.
And when you look at some of the spiritual components of AA, how do you think he got to that?
No,
right?
I know. I just watched that on the How to Change Your Brain. Is it Michael Pollan? Dr. Michael Pollan? Yeah. He wrote a book, but now it's a documentary on Netflix. And one of the things that I was so floored about, they said, before Bill W. had this spiritual awakening, he took LSD. And I was like,
and
it's crazy.
He wrote back and forth to Carl Jung, and I use a lot of Jungian psychology, when I'm talking about the archetypes within you,
right.
This mother archetype coming in forward. What does she want? And I'm asking you these questions like you have multiple personalities.
Right.
That's very Jungian, right?
Is he the internal family systems founder?
So that's Dr. Richard Schwartz.
Okay.
And then, but I would say that the two models of psychotherapy that I practice or use the most in ketamine assisted psychotherapy are internal family systems, aka parts work, from Dr. Richard Schwartz. And the other is Carl Jung, who's, he was a Swiss psychoanalyst who sort of fell out from Freud. And, Freud really believed that the id was bad, that we all had this urge, and that human beings, he was almost like a pessimist, that everything was about wanting to have sex with everybody or murder everybody. And it's almost like our ego had to repress that, right? Jung sort of broke away from him, and he really believed that we have this innate potential for good, but also for evil and the shadow and the parts of our personality that we want to disown. And he was really in his era shunned because he brought spirituality into psychology. He talked about the collective unconscious, that there are these archetypes common to all human beings, and that through time, when that archetype rises up from the collective unconscious, that's not from your childhood history. That is from our souls being connected or something in that spiritual realm. And when you think about Carl Jung and Bill W. writing back and forth, Bill W. really wanted to bring spirituality, and I think he did a really good job with the big book and, creating this program of rigorous honesty and the spiritual friendship that is inherent in 12-step programs. And human beings, especially now that if you look at, in the 60s and 70s, how many Americans went to church, it was really high. Yeah. And now it's very low. Mm-hmm. We all are craving, we're yearning for spiritual experience. And what's interesting is that there's another book where this researcher did a lot of research, and there's evidence that early Christians, the Eucharist, that there was this psychedelic fungus that was maybe part of that tradition. And the early church was not big churches. It was people in houses. And, there are religious organizations, there's a loophole where you can take psychedelics in America if you're part of one of these churches that uses psychedelics as a rite. And a lot of them are Christian, and,
they're Christian?
And there are other ones too, right? There are more different branches and different religious traditions. But if you look at that, don't we all need something spiritual in our lives? Yes. And this modern world, doesn't it make it so success driven? And that's good. It's nice to have nice things and security and a 401k and a nice car that functions. But it's also so interesting because if that's all we have, that's depressing. That
was literally my crisis last week. I was like, what if I don't want to be a boss babe or a trad wife? Like, what if I don't want to be either? Like, those are my only options right now. There's just no other options. The other thing I thought was so crazy is like Ram Dass, who I always thought was some like monk that came from India or something. It's like his name was like Richard something. And he also was a psychologist who had a psychedelic experience and found the spiritual world and just lived there forever. And now he's Ram Dass.
That's right.
I'm like, what? Why does nobody know this stuff? But if there's anything that you want to leave the listeners with that they should know about ketamine treatment, or even about you and where they can find you.
I think the best advice for you, Aurora, and for anybody listening is, just make time and space to listen to your higher self. So if this is something that you're considering, get really still and ask your higher self, don't think about the answer. Just ask, what does my higher self want me to know? What does my higher self want me to do? And if you wait for that answer to come up, that is usually the intuitive right answer for you. I don't tell people what to do. I just help them to access the higher self within themselves. So, people want to know about me. I'm on social media. My handle is Dr Mike Dow across social media. My latest book is The Ketamine Breakthrough, which is all about ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And I just want to say I'm so honored to work with you. It was so beautiful to watch this transformation in you.
I feel like it was meant to be. Thank you to my date that didn't work out. I feel like it's so funny the way life takes you places.
Synchronicity.
It's so crazy. I'm just so happy that we got to meet, and I can't say enough about my experience with ketamine. I think I'm going to do one more session. That'll make 3, and I think that'll be good for me. And then probably do some maintenance along the way. But I don't know, those of you who listen, can you hear a difference in me from today, from like last week? Although if you guys still stuck around, I don't know. Anyway, over and out. Thanks for listening.